April 29, 1945. Okinawa. A young man crouches in a shell crater while machine gun fire tears through the air 6 inches above his head. His hands shake as he wraps a tourniquet around a soldier's shattered leg. Blood soaks through the bandage. The wounded man screams. Around them, the sound of battle drowns out everything except the instinct to survive. The young man carries no rifle, no pistol, no grenades. His only weapons are morphine, sulfa powder, and bandages that never seem enough. When his unit discovered he refused to touch a weapon, they called him a coward. When sergeants ordered him to carry a rifle for self-defense, he politely declined and accepted the punishment. When his fellow soldiers learned he wouldn't kill even to save his own life, they spat the word conscientious objector like a curse. But on this ridge on Okinawa, while enemy fire turns the earth into hell, he will climb that cliff 75 times. He will lower wounded men on a rope he fashioned from cargo netting. He will save 75 lives in a single night while bullets search for him in the darkness. And the men who called him a coward will weep when they speak his name. This is the story of courage that wore the face of cowardice. Of men who refused to kill but ran toward death to save the dying. Of a war that tried to crush their convictions and instead revealed what bravery truly means. In 1940, when Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act, America faced a question it had never fully resolved. What do you do with men whose faith forbids them from taking human life? The answer was Section 5G, conscientious objection. Men could refuse combat duty if religious training and belief prevented them from participating in war. They would serve in non-combatant roles. Medical corps, ambulance drivers, chaplain assistants. The military reluctantly accepted these provisions. The men themselves faced something far worse than official policy. Thomas Bennett grew up in a small coal mining town in West Virginia. His family belonged to the Church of the Brethren, a peace church that had opposed violence since its founding in 1708. When his draft notice arrived in early 1943, Bennett's father placed both hands on his shoulders and reminded him of their faith's central teaching. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, turn the other cheek. Bennett registered as a conscientious objector. He was willing to serve, willing to face danger, willing to die for his country. He simply could not kill. When he arrived at basic training at Fort Lee, Virginia, the other recruits saw the 1-0 designation on his papers. Non-combatant. Conscientious objector. The words might as well have been coward written in red ink. The hazing started immediately. They called him Conchi, yellow belly, traitor. They said he was hiding behind religion to avoid real service. That he'd let his buddies die rather than defend them. That he was worse than the enemy because at least the enemy had the courage to fight. The drill sergeants didn't stop it. Some encouraged it. They assigned conscientious objectors the worst details. Latrine duty, kitchen work, anything to humiliate them. During rifle training, when objectors politely refused to handle weapons, sergeants made them stand at attention for hours. Push-ups until their arms gave out. Run laps until they vomited. One sergeant at Fort Lee took particular pleasure in singling out Bennett during morning formation. He'd make Bennett stand in front of the entire company while he explained to everyone that this was what a coward looked like. That Bennett was going to get real soldiers killed because he was too much of a weakling to defend them. That the uniform he wore was a disgrace to every man who'd ever put on the colors. Bennett stood at attention through these speeches. Never responded. Never showed emotion. His silence only made the sergeant angrier. Other conscientious objectors faced worse. At Fort Benning, a group of trainees tied a CO to his bunk one night and beat him with bars of soap wrapped in towels, a technique that left no visible marks. At Camp Stewart, someone threw a conscientious objector's Bible into a latrine. When he retrieved it and cleaned it, they did it again. And again. Until he finally stopped retrieving it and just stood there, staring at the filthy water, tears running down his face. The military's position was officially neutral. Conscientious objectors were recognized under federal law. Their status was legitimate. But between official policy and daily reality existed a gulf where prejudice thrived. Officers looked the other way. Chaplains offered little support. The men who should have protected COs from harassment often participated in it. The message was clear. You may have the right to refuse combat, but we'll make you regret exercising it. Bennett endured it without complaint. But the words left marks deeper than any physical punishment. At night in the barracks, lying in his bunk while the others talked and laughed and excluded him from their circle, Bennett wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. Not about his faith, that remained steady, but about his ability to serve. If his own countrymen despised him this much, what good could he possibly do? The doubt grew during field exercises. When his unit practiced assault tactics, Bennett followed with his medical bag while the others advanced with rifles. He watched them move in coordinated fire teams, covering each other, working together. He was separate. Always separate. Moving alone behind them like a shadow they wished would disappear. During a night march in December 1943, Bennett slipped on ice-covered rocks and twisted his ankle. The pain was sharp enough to make him gasp. He fell to one knee, tried to stand, couldn't put weight on the injured foot. The column marched past him. Every soldier in his platoon. Not one stopped to help. They left him there in the darkness, alone on a freezing trail in the Virginia mountains. He sat there for perhaps 10 minutes, testing his ankle, knowing it wasn't broken but badly sprained. Eventually he fashioned a splint from branches in his belt, wrapped it tight and limped back to base. Arrived 3 hours after the rest of his unit. The sergeant who'd been hazing him wrote him up for falling behind. Added it to his file as evidence of poor physical conditioning. Never asked why no one had helped him. Didn't care. Joseph LaPointe felt the same doubt. He'd grown up in Michigan, attended a Mennonite church where Sunday school teachers told stories of Anabaptist martyrs who chose death over violence. When his draft notice came, his congregation prayed over him. His minister reminded him that following Christ meant taking up the cross, not the sword. LaPointe believed this. Completely. But belief didn't make the hatred easier to bear. At Fort Benning, Georgia, the hazing took a different form. His fellow trainees didn't beat him. They simply erased him. Refused to acknowledge his existence. When he spoke, they acted like they didn't hear. When he entered a room, they left. When teams were formed for any task, he was always the last picked, always paired with whoever drew the short straw. He'd gone from being a normal young man with friends and social standing to being invisible. A ghost in uniform. The isolation was crushing in ways physical violence wasn't. LaPointe wrote letters home describing the loneliness. His mother wrote back with verses from scripture. His father encouraged him to stay strong. His younger sister sent him packages of homemade cookies that the other soldiers refused to eat because they came from a coward's family. He ate those cookies alone. Every crumb. Tasted his sister's love in every bite and wondered if he'd ever share a meal with anyone again. At Fort Benning, Georgia, another objector named Desmond Doss faced particularly vicious treatment. Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist from Virginia. Quiet. Polite. Unshakable in his conviction that the Sixth Commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," meant exactly what it said. His unit decided to drive him out. They hid his boots so he'd be late for formation, poured water on his bunk, broke his personal belongings. When he refused to retaliate, they escalated. One night, several soldiers cornered him in the barracks and threatened to beat him unless he picked up a rifle. Doss looked at them with quiet eyes and said he couldn't do that. He was sorry if it made them angry, but he couldn't. They beat him anyway. Not severely. Just enough to make their point. The officers noticed but did nothing. The prevailing attitude was that conscientious objectors brought this treatment on themselves. If they wanted to be accepted, they should stop being difficult. Carry a rifle like everyone else. Stop making moral stands that implied regular soldiers were doing something wrong. What the military didn't understand, what the other soldiers couldn't see, was that these men weren't choosing the easy path. They were choosing the hardest one imaginable. It would have been simpler to carry a weapon they never intended to use. To blend in. To avoid the contempt and isolation. Instead, they accepted persecution as the price of conviction. They endured hatred from the very men they'd soon risk their lives to save. By early 1944, thousands of conscientious objectors had been trained as combat medics. They learned to stop bleeding, set fractures, treat shock, administer morphine. They practiced under fire simulations, learning to work while explosions detonated nearby and instructors fired blank ammunition over their heads. The training was realistic. The instructors were professional. But the atmosphere was poisonous. Medics who carried weapons received respect. Those who refused were marked. Separate. Suspect. Their competence didn't matter. Their willingness to serve didn't matter. They had refused to kill, and in the military's eyes, that made them fundamentally unreliable. When Bennett's unit shipped out to the Pacific in March 1944, assigned to the 77th Infantry Division, the other soldiers made their feelings clear. They didn't want him. They didn't trust him. When the shooting started, they said he'd probably run and hide. Bennett listened to these predictions. He didn't argue. Didn't defend himself. He simply packed his medical supplies, wrote a letter home to his parents explaining that he was about to test his faith in ways he'd never imagined, and prayed that when the moment came he wouldn't fail. The question wasn't whether he had courage. The question was whether anyone would recognize it. Guam. July 21, 1944. The landing craft door dropped and Bennett stepped into chest-deep water. Japanese machine gun fire ripped across the beach. The soldier next to him, a private from Tennessee who'd called him Conchi just that morning, took a bullet through the throat and fell backward into the surf. Blood turned the water pink, then red, spreading in patterns that looked almost beautiful in the early morning light. Bennett froze for perhaps 2 seconds. Long enough to understand that war wasn't like the training films. Long enough to smell cordite and blood and fear. Long enough to realize that every nightmare he'd imagined was infinitely worse than the reality. The private was still alive, thrashing in the water, his hands trying to stop the blood pumping from his severed artery. His eyes found Bennett's. What? Terrified. Already dimming. Then training took over. Bennett waded toward him, got both arms under the man's shoulders, and dragged him toward the beach. Bullets snapped past his head. He could hear them crack through the air, supersonic rounds that would kill him if they connected by an inch in any direction. Mortar rounds exploded in the surf, throwing up geysers of water and sand and shrapnel. He kept moving. The private's blood soaked through Bennett's uniform. Warm. Sticky. The man was trying to speak, lips moving but only bubbling sounds came out. Bennett wanted to tell him he'd be okay, wanted to offer comfort, but there was no comfort to give. The wound was fatal. They both knew it. They reached the sand and Bennett laid him down as gently as he could. Applied pressure to the wound even though it was useless. Gave him morphine to ease the transition. Held his hand while he died. It took 90 seconds. Felt like hours. When the private's eyes went still, Bennett said a prayer over him. The same prayer his mother had taught him when he was 6 years old, then stood and looked for the next casualty. There were dozens. Hundreds. Men with their legs blown off. Soldiers holding their intestines in with bloody hands. Marines screaming for their mothers. The beach was a slaughterhouse and Bennett moved through it with his medical bag, treating the savable, comforting the dying, ignoring the fire that searched for him constantly. He worked for 14 hours straight. When darkness fell, he kept working by feel, his hands slick with other men's blood, his uniform soaked with sea water and gore. Around midnight, a sergeant found him treating a private whose foot had been partially severed by shrapnel. The sergeant, the same one who'd called Bennett a coward during training, stood there watching. When Bennett finished and moved to the next casualty, the sergeant grabbed his arm. "I was wrong about you," the sergeant said. Nothing more. But his voice broke on the last word. LaPointe's baptism came on Leyte in the Philippines. October 1944. His unit was pinned down in a rice paddy while Japanese positions on the tree line poured automatic weapons fire into their exposed position. The company commander was hit. Then the executive officer. Then both platoon leaders. Command structure collapsed. Soldiers hugged the ground, too terrified to move forward, unable to retreat. LaPointe saw a private 20 yards away take a bullet through the shoulder. The man was screaming, thrashing in the water. No one moved to help him. Moving meant dying. LaPointe looked at the wounded soldier. Looked at the tree line. Looked at his medical bag. He thought about his mother reading the telegram that would say he'd been killed. He thought about the promises he'd made to himself about staying safe. Then he thought about what it meant to love your neighbor as yourself. He stood up and ran toward the wounded man. The 20 yards felt like 20 miles. Bullets kicked up water around his feet. He heard them crack past his ears, felt them tug at his uniform. He didn't think. He just ran. He reached the private, grabbed him by the harness and dragged him back toward cover. Halfway there, LaPointe felt something punch him in the side. No pain, just impact. He kept dragging. Got the private behind a dike. Realized he'd been shot. The wound was superficial. The bullet had creased his ribs, torn a furrow through skin and muscle, but missed anything vital. LaPointe bandaged himself, then finished treating the private. Then he went back into the rice paddy because there were more wounded. He made 4 trips total before the company was able to withdraw. Saved 7 men. Got shot twice more. Once through the thigh, once across the upper arm. Refused evacuation until every wounded soldier had been pulled back. When they finally got him to an aid station, the doctor who examined him counted 17 separate wounds. Bullets and shrapnel. Any one of them could have been fatal. None were serious enough to stop him from working. The doctor looked at LaPointe's conscientious objector status on his medical form, then looked at his wounds, then looked at his face. "You're the bravest man I've ever met," the doctor said. LaPointe didn't know what to say to that. He didn't feel brave. He felt terrified and exhausted and wondering if he'd have the strength to do it again. He would. Many times. But it was Desmond Doss on Okinawa who would transform how the entire military viewed conscientious objectors. April 29, 1945. The Maeda Escarpment. American soldiers called it Hacksaw Ridge, a 400-foot cliff where Japanese defenders had turned every cave, every boulder, every tree into a killing position. The 77th Infantry Division had been ordered to take it. Doss's company climbed rope ladders up the face of the cliff in broad daylight. Japanese soldiers waited until they reached the top, then opened fire from positions so well concealed they were nearly impossible to locate. The Americans were slaughtered. Within minutes, half the company was dead or wounded. The survivors tried to organize a defense, but Japanese fire was overwhelming. The order came to retreat. Get off the ridge. Regroup. Try again later. Doss didn't retreat. He stayed on that ridge alone while his unit withdrew, climbing back down the ropes they'd used to ascend. He could hear his sergeant screaming at him to fall back, to get off the ridge, that it was suicide to stay. Doss pretended not to hear. He moved from wounded man to wounded man, crawling through mud and blood and pieces of people he tried not to look at too closely. The first casualty he reached had taken a burst of machine gun fire across the chest. 3 holes, each pumping blood with every heartbeat. Doss packed the wounds with gauze, applied pressure bandages, gave morphine. The soldier grabbed his wrist. "Leave me," he said. "Save yourself." Doss looked at him with those quiet eyes. I can't do that. He dragged the soldier to the cliff edge. The rope he'd fashioned from cargo netting wasn't ideal, rough hemp that tore his hands bloody as he worked, but it held. He tied it around the soldier's chest in a harness, tested the knot, then lowered him over the edge. Hand over hand. 80 feet. The weight pulled at his shoulders, threatened to tear his arms from their sockets. His wounded hand screamed with pain. He kept lowering. When the rope went slack, signal that the men below had received the casualty, Doss pulled it back up and looked for the next wounded soldier. He worked through the afternoon under constant fire. Japanese soldiers could see him moving across the ridge. They shot at him. Repeatedly. Bullets kicked up dirt next to his feet, spanged off rocks by his head, tore through his uniform without touching flesh. At one point, a Japanese soldier charged his position with a bayonet. Doss didn't have time to run. The soldier was on him, blade raised, face twisted with fury. Doss closed his eyes and prayed. The soldier fell 10 feet away, shot by one of Doss's own men who'd stayed behind against orders to provide covering fire. The American soldier yelled at Doss to get down, to take cover, to stop being an idiot. Doss thanked him and kept working. Evening came. The sun set over the Pacific, painting the ridge in shades of red and gold. Beautiful. Incongruous. Men were dying in this beauty, bleeding out on rocks while the sky turned colors that belonged in postcards. Doss found a Marine, not his unit but that didn't matter, who'd been hit by a grenade. His legs were shredded. Bone showed through torn muscle. He was conscious, aware enough to know he was dying. Just let me go, the Marine said. I'm done. Doss shook his head. Started bandaging the legs. You're not done. Not yet. Why do you care? The Marine's voice was bitter. You don't even know me. Don't have to know you to care. Doss worked for 20 minutes on that Marine. Stopped the bleeding. Stabilized him enough for transport. Got him to the rope and lowered him down. The Marine was crying by the time he disappeared over the edge. Whether from pain or something else, Doss couldn't tell. Night fell completely. Total darkness except for the occasional flare that turned the ridge into a nightmare landscape of shadows and death. Doss worked by feel. His hands knew what to do even when he couldn't see. Tourniquet. Bandage. Morphine. Lower the rope. Pull it back up. Find the next one. He prayed constantly. Not formal prayers. Just conversations with God. Dear God, help me get one more. Just one more. That's all I ask. One more. Japanese soldiers swept the ridge multiple times during the night. Doss heard them coming, their boots on rock, their voices calling to each other in a language he didn't understand. He pressed himself into craters, into crevices, holding his breath while they passed within feet of his position. They never found him. Once, a Japanese soldier stood directly over the crater where Doss was hiding with a wounded American. The enemy soldier was silhouetted against the stars. Doss could have grabbed his ankle, pulled him down, killed him with his hands. The man was that close. Doss didn't move. Didn't even breathe. The Japanese soldier stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, then moved on. The wounded American whispered, "Why didn't you kill him?" "Can't," Doss said. "Not my way. He would have killed you. Maybe. But then I couldn't have saved you." The soldier didn't respond to that. Just lay there in the darkness, thinking about what kind of man would risk his life to save an enemy rather than kill him to save himself. He lowered 75 men that night. Some unconscious. Some screaming. Some so badly wounded they begged him to leave them behind. He refused. Every life mattered. Every man deserved the chance to survive. When dawn came and American forces retook the ridge, they found Doss still working. Still treating the wounded. His uniform was shredded. His hands were raw from the rope. He'd been shot through the hand at some point but had bandaged it himself and kept going. The soldiers who'd called him a coward stood in silence. What do you say to a man who did what Doss had done? How do you apologize for the things you said? Doss didn't require an apology. He never mentioned the insults, the hazing, the contempt. When officers asked him how he'd managed to save 75 men, he simply said he prayed before lowering each one. "Dear God, help me get one more. One more. Then one more. Then one more. Until all of them were safe." The transformation didn't happen overnight. Even after Guam, after Leyte, after Hacksaw Ridge, some soldiers still harbored doubts about conscientious objectors. Old prejudices die hard. The idea that a man could be courageous without being willing to kill challenged assumptions built over centuries of military tradition. But the evidence became impossible to ignore. By the end of the war, conscientious objectors serving as combat medics had earned dozens of medals for valor. Bronze stars, silver stars, distinguished service crosses. They'd proven themselves in every theater, every battle, every desperate situation where courage was tested. Thomas Bennett earned the Medal of Honor. Not for Guam, though his actions there were heroic enough. He earned it in the Philippines, where he single-handedly treated 23 wounded men under fire, refused evacuation despite his own wounds, and continued working until he was killed by a Japanese sniper while administering plasma to a dying soldier. The citation read, Private First Class Bennett's extraordinary courage, complete disregard for personal safety, and devotion to his comrades represent the highest traditions of military service. No mention of his conscientious objector status. No asterisk explaining that he'd achieved all this without carrying a weapon. Just recognition of courage in its purest form. Joseph LaPointe survived the war. He returned to Michigan, married, had children, and rarely spoke about his service. When his grandchildren asked him if he'd been a hero, he always said no. He'd just been a medic. Done his job. Nothing special. His combat record told a different story. 2 Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars for Purple Hearts. Wounded 7 times. Returned to duty after each injury. Treated over 200 casualties under fire. Credited with saving 43 lives. His church congregation wanted to honor him with a special service. He declined. Said the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. Desmond Doss became the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor. President Truman presented it to him at a White House ceremony in October 1945. Truman, who'd been an artillery officer in World War I, shook Doss's hand and said, "I'm glad to see you got a medal for not killing people." Doss smiled. "Thank you, Mr. President. I'm glad I could serve in my own way." The military's attitude toward conscientious objectors evolved, but slowly. After the war, training protocols changed. Medics who refused to carry weapons were no longer subject to official harassment. Their contributions were acknowledged. Their courage was recognized. But the deeper transformation happened person to person, in the memories of men who'd been saved by conscientious objectors. A veteran named Robert Bush, who'd fought on Okinawa, spent decades telling anyone who would listen about the medic who'd saved his life. Bush had taken shrapnel to the abdomen on May 3, 1945. The metal had torn through his liver and intestines. He was bleeding out in a foxhole, had accepted that he was going to die. He could feel his life draining away. Cold creeping up from his feet. Vision narrowing to a tunnel. His mother's face appearing in his mind, the last thing he'd see before darkness. Then the medic arrived, a conscientious objector Bush had previously dismissed as a coward. Had called him worse than that. Had made his life hell during training back at Camp Shelby. The medic dropped into the foxhole while machine gun fire tore up the ground above. Started working immediately. Calm. Efficient. Like he did this every day. Which Bush later learned he did. "You're going to be fine," the medic said. Voice steady. Confident. Bush wanted to believe him but couldn't. There was too much blood. Too much pain. He was dying and they both knew it. The medic treated his wounds anyway. Packed the abdominal cavity with gauze, applied pressure bandages, started a plasma transfusion. Then he lifted Bush onto his shoulders, fireman's carry, and ran 200 yards to a jeep. Ran while bullets chased them. Ran while mortars exploded around them. Ran like Bush weighed nothing instead of 180 pounds plus equipment. Got him to the jeep. Rode with him to the aid station. Stayed with him through surgery. Held his hand while the surgeon worked, while the anesthesia failed and Bush screamed and thrashed and begged them to let him die. The medic never let go. Bush survived. Spent 6 months in hospitals recovering. Returned home to Illinois. Built a life. Got married. Had children. Grandchildren. The medic went back to the front lines 3 days after saving Bush. Was killed by a Japanese sniper while treating another wounded soldier. Took the bullet in the back while bending over a casualty. Died instantly. Bush never learned the medic's name. The chaos of war, the breakdown in record keeping, the simple fact that no one thought to tell him. For 53 years he carried that debt. Every anniversary of his wounding, he'd think about the unnamed medic. Every Memorial Day he'd honor him. When people criticized conscientious objectors, and they did frequently throughout the Cold War in Vietnam and beyond, Bush would tell them about that medic who saved him while bombs fell and bullets flew, who had more courage in his little finger than most soldiers had in their entire bodies. "You want to know what bravery looks like?" Bush would say, voice shaking with emotion even decades later. "It looks like a man running into hell to save someone who'd been nothing but cruel to him. Who'd made his life miserable. Who'd called him a coward and worse. That man saved me anyway. Never hesitated. Never held a grudge. Just did his job better than anyone else could have." Bush spent years searching for the medic's identity. Wrote letters to the Veterans Administration. Contacted his old unit. Searched through casualty records. Finally, in 1998, a researcher found the name in an archived file. Corporal James Pritchard. Church of the Brethren. Kansas. 22 years old when he died. Bush traveled to Kansas. Found Pritchard's grave in a small cemetery outside Topeka. Laid flowers. Stood there for an hour talking to a man he'd never properly thanked. Telling him about the life he'd lived, the children and grandchildren who existed because Pritchard had refused to let him die. "I'm sorry," Bush said to the headstone. "I'm sorry for what I called you. For what I thought about you. You were braver than I ever was. Braver than I ever could be." These stories multiplied. Spread. Changed minds. A paratrooper from the 82nd Airborne described how a conscientious objector medic had jumped into Normandy without a weapon, landed in a tree under German fire, cut himself down, and immediately started treating casualties while still dangling from his parachute harness. A Marine on Iwo Jima remembered a medic who'd crawled across 200 yards of volcanic ash to reach a wounded man, got shot through the leg, bandaged himself, finished treating the casualty, dragged him back to friendly lines, then returned to do it again. A soldier in the Battle of the Bulge told about a medic who'd worked for 36 hours straight in sub-zero temperatures, treating frostbite and wounds, sharing his own rations with wounded men, refusing evacuation until every casualty was stabilized. They found him the next morning, frozen to death, still holding a wounded soldier in his arms to keep the man warm. The courage wasn't abstract. It was specific. Documented. Witnessed by men who had no reason to lie and every reason to respect it. By the Korean War, conscientious objectors who served as medics were viewed differently. Not with automatic suspicion but with cautious respect. The military had learned what the men themselves had always known, that refusing to kill doesn't mean refusing to serve. Vietnam tested this lesson again. Conscientious objectors faced renewed hostility, both from the military and from civilian society. But the medics who served proved the same thing their predecessors had proven. They ran toward danger. They saved lives. They demonstrated courage that didn't require a weapon. The transformation wasn't complete. Probably never will be. There will always be those who believe that true courage requires the willingness to kill, that pacifism is inherently cowardly, that refusing violence is the same as refusing to stand. But the men who fought beside conscientious objector medics learned differently. They learned that courage has many faces. That conviction can be stronger than bullets. That the man who refuses to kill can still be the bravest person in the unit. They learned it because they watched it happen. Because they were saved by it. Because they lived when they should have died, rescued by men they'd called cowards. Thomas Bennett's mother received his Medal of Honor in a ceremony at Fort Lee, Virginia. The same base where her son had endured hazing and contempt for refusing to carry a weapon. The commanding officer who presented the medal told her that Bennett was one of the finest soldiers ever to serve in the United States Army. She accepted the medal with pride and grief in equal measure. Pride that her son's courage had been recognized. Grief that the recognition came too late for him to see it. She lived until 1998. Spent 53 years telling her son's story to anyone who would listen. When people asked how she'd raised such a brave young man, she always said the same thing. I taught him that loving your enemy is harder than hating him. And that doing the harder thing is what makes you brave. Desmond Doss survived the war but carried wounds for the rest of his life. Physical wounds from the bullets and shrapnel. Psychological wounds from the things he'd seen. Spiritual wounds from the cost of his convictions. He never regretted his choice. Never wavered in his belief that the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," meant what it said. When interviewers asked if he'd been tempted to pick up a weapon to defend himself to make his life easier, he always smiled and said, "Every single day." But courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. He died in 2006 at age 87. His funeral was attended by hundreds of veterans he'd saved, their children, their grandchildren. They came to honor the man who'd shown them what true courage looked like. Joseph LaPointe lived quietly in Michigan until his death in 2012. He worked as a teacher, raised 4 children, attended his Mennonite church every Sunday. He rarely mentioned his service. When pressed, he'd say he'd been a medic, nothing more. His daughter discovered his medals after he died, found them wrapped in cloth at the back of a drawer. She'd never known he was a war hero. He'd never told her. Among his possessions, she found a letter he'd written to his congregation in 1945 but never sent. Read. Some people think courage means being willing to kill for your beliefs. I think it means being willing to die for them without killing anyone. I don't know which is harder. But I know which one feels right to me. When I'm under fire treating the wounded, part of me screams to pick up a gun. To defend myself. To make the fear stop. It would be so easy. There are always weapons lying around. Dead soldiers don't need their rifles anymore. But if I picked up that gun, I'd be admitting that my faith was conditional. That I only believed in loving my enemies when it was safe. That the commandments only applied when following them didn't cost me anything. So I keep my hands empty. I run toward the bullets instead of away from them. I save the men who called me a coward. I prove my faith not by talking about it, but by living it when living it might get me killed. Maybe that's what courage really is. Not the absence of fear. Not even the mastery of fear. But the willingness to do what's right regardless of the cost. I'm afraid every single day. Every time I hear gunfire, I want to hide. Every time I see a wounded man, part of me wants to walk past and pretend I didn't see him. Self-preservation is strong. The urge to survive trumps almost everything. Almost. But not faith. Not conviction. Not the knowledge that if I compromise on this, I compromise on everything that makes me who I am. So I stay true. I keep working. I save who I can and trust God with the rest. And when I die, because I probably will, the odds aren't good for combat medics, I hope people understand that I wasn't being stubborn. I was being faithful. There's a difference. The letter was dated April 7, 1945. 3 weeks before he was killed. The legacy of conscientious objectors who served as combat medics is complicated. They proved that courage doesn't require violence, that conviction can be stronger than fear, that love for your fellow man can overcome hatred and prejudice. But their service also raises difficult questions that have never been fully answered. If these men could serve with such distinction without weapons, what does that say about the necessity of violence? If refusing to kill made them more effective soldiers in some ways, more willing to risk their lives, more committed to saving others, does that challenge our assumptions about what military service requires? The military has never fully embraced these implications. Conscientious objectors are still viewed with some suspicion. Still required to prove themselves in ways regular soldiers aren't. Still marked as different, separate, other. But the men who served beside them remember. They remember being saved by hands that refused to hold a gun. They remember courage that looked like cowardice until tested by fire. They remember the medics who ran toward danger while others sought cover, who stayed behind while others retreated, who gave everything for men who'd called them cowards. Today, at the National Museum of the United States Army, there's a small exhibit about conscientious objectors who served as combat medics. It includes Desmond Doss's Medal of Honor, Thomas Bennett's Purple Heart, Joseph LaPointe's Silver Star. The exhibit also includes photographs. Men in uniforms, medical bags over their shoulders, no weapons visible. Their faces are serious. Yeah. Some look frightened. Some look determined. All of them look like heroes, even though most people walking past don't recognize them as such. Because that's the final lesson of their service. That courage often looks like something else. Like weakness. Like cowardice. Like foolishness. It takes fire to burn away the disguise and reveal what's underneath. These men walked into that fire willingly. They endured hatred and contempt. They faced death without the comfort of being able to kill in return. They saved lives instead of taking them, and in doing so proved that the hardest thing a soldier can do isn't killing the enemy. It's loving them enough to refuse. That contradiction, that impossibility, defines their legacy. They served in a profession built on violence while refusing to participate in it. They earned the respect of warriors while rejecting warfare itself. They proved themselves in battle while denying battle's fundamental premise. The military still doesn't know what to make of them. Neither does society. We honor their courage but question their choices. We admire their sacrifice but suspect their motives. We call them heroes but can't quite accept what their heroism implies. Maybe that discomfort is the point. Maybe courage is supposed to challenge us, to make us question our assumptions about strength and weakness, about bravery and cowardice, about what it means to serve. Maybe the greatest courage is doing what everyone else thinks is impossible. Not killing when killing is expected. Not fighting when fighting is required. Not hating when hatred is all around you. 75 men lowered down a cliff on Okinawa. 700 lives saved across battlefields in 3 continents. Thousands of wounded soldiers who survived because someone refused to carry a gun but ran toward the bullets anyway. That's the legacy. Not monuments or museums or medals, though those matter. The real legacy lives in the families who exist because a conscientious objector saved their grandfather. In the lessons taught by men who learned that courage has many faces. In the quiet recognition that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse. When Thomas Bennett's niece visited his grave in Manila in 2019, she placed flowers on the marker and stood in silence for a long time. Then she said something to him, speaking to a man she'd never met but whose story had shaped her entire understanding of what it meant to be brave. She said, "Thank you for showing us that love is stronger than fear. That conviction is stronger than violence. That the hardest battle isn't against the enemy. It's against the parts of ourselves that want to hate them." April 29, 1945. A rope made of cargo netting. 75 men lowered to safety. One man who refused to kill but faced death to save the dying. When they called him a coward, he didn't argue. He just kept working. Kept believing. Kept proving that courage sometimes wears a disguise, and only fire reveals its true face. The fire revealed it. And the men who saw it spent the rest of their lives trying to explain what they'd witnessed. Trying to describe courage that looked like cowardice until tested. Trying to honor the medics who saved them while everyone else called those medics weak. They never found adequate words. Some truths are too large for language. But they remembered. They told the stories. They passed the lessons to their children and their children's children. And slowly, imperfectly, the world began to understand. That true courage isn't about what you're willing to kill for. It's about what you're willing to die for without killing anyone. That the hardest thing a human being can do is love when everyone else chooses hate. That sometimes, not always, not often, but sometimes, the greatest warriors are the ones who refuse to fight.